The village sat cradled between thick hills and shadowed woods, where the sun rarely reached and the wind always carried whispers. Fog drifted low across the ground like something alive, curling around fences and slipping through door cracks. No one dared speak after dark unless it was in prayer. Fires were kept small. Doors stayed bolted. And every full moon the bells were rung, not to call but to warn. No one in the village remembered exactly when the fear had begun. It was simply always there, passed down like a cold shiver through generations. Mothers hushed their children with stories of the cursed woman, the one whose eyes could see sin and truth and death before it came. The one who walked barefoot, left no prints and knew how to speak to the wind. Her name was rarely spoken now, lost or buried like a bone too deep to dig up. But the older ones still remembered. She had lived alone on the edge of the woods, in a cottage filled with drying herbs and colored glass bottles that glinted strangely in the light. She helped with births when babies came early, cured fevers when others had given up, and whispered to bees so they'd come back in spring. Some said she sang to the moon. Some swore she never aged. Some claimed she walked in dreams. When the sickness came, sudden and sharp, with black rashes and choking coughs, it was easier to point than to understand. Easier to accuse than to heal. A child had died. Then two more. People were angry, afraid, desperate. The prayers didn't work. So they turned on the woman who didn't need them. They dragged her from her cottage, her hands tied with twine, her long hair tangled with bits of dried leaves and bone charms. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She only looked at them, and that, they said, was the worst of it. Her eyes didn't hold fear, they held knowing. As if she saw something they never would. As if she had already watched the end of everything. They didn't burn her. No fire would catch. The wood was too wet. The air too heavy. So they blinded her. They took her deep into the forest, to the oldest part where trees were bent and twisted like knotted fingers. There they used a blade, then salt. They called it cleansing. Mercy even. She would no longer see evil, they said. No longer curse anyone. No longer frighten their dreams. She bled but didn't cry out. She walked into the woods, blind but steady, her steps slow and sure. She vanished beyond the tree line, swallowed by fog. They waited. Some say they heard a song carried on the wind. Others say silence fell like a blanket, thick and wrong. They searched later just to be sure. They found no body. But on one tree, a tall one with bark blackened from old lightning, someone carved two eyes, deep, perfect hollows where sap ran red like tears. No one claimed to have done it. No one could bring themselves to touch it. From that day on, the mist grew heavier. The forest grew thicker. And the village began to whisper of eyes that still watched even without a face. Eyes that remembered. Eyes that saw. The village had no official name, at least not one anyone used anymore. The old signs had long since rotted away, their words faded and forgotten. Outsiders, if any ever came, called it that place near the mist, or the village beyond the ridge, but even maps seemed to avoid marking it. It was as if the land itself had agreed to keep the village hidden. The people who lived there didn't mind. They believed safety lived in silence and survival depended on being forgotten. Tucked between the forest and the hills, surrounded by fog and shadow, the village had its own way of living, passed down like a worn cloak, patched, secretive and heavy with old rules. They didn't speak names aloud unless at birth, marriage or death. Names they believed gave things power. Children were often called by nicknames or not at all until they could speak their first prayer. Mirrors were rare. Bells rang only to warn. Cats were not welcome. Twins were feared. And every home had a sprig of dried lavender over the door, even though no one quite remembered why. Magic, or anything that resembled it, was treated with quiet dread. A girl who dreamed too vividly might be given bitter tea to calm her mind. A boy who talked to birds was taught to stay silent. Stories were carefully told, stripped of wonder, wrapped in warnings. There were no festivals, no songs after dark. Only work, worship, and whispers. And always, there was the forest, looming just beyond the edge of the fields, watching like a living thing. No one went in past the second row of trees. Not since the time of the burnings. Not since the cleansing. The cleansing was the name given to the terrible season generations ago, when disease swept through the village and fear turned neighbors into enemies. Many were accused. Some vanished. Some were punished publicly. Most of the old records were burned. It was said the fire purified the village, that it kept the shadows at bay. But some whispered that the fire had only buried the truth, not destroyed it. Those whispers often turned to a name no one said loudly, the hollow-eyed woman. Some claimed she still roamed the forest with blood on her breath. Others said she came in dreams, leaving a strange feeling behind, like grief wrapped in frost. A few believed she was a warning, a reminder of what happened when a village lets fear eat its own heart. Alina had grown up hearing all the stories. Her grandmother had told them in hushed tones, eyes darting toward the windows even when they were alone. But unlike others, Alina never seemed afraid. Curious, yes, always. She asked too many questions, lingered too long at the edge of the woods, and spent more time with books than with people. That made her odd, suspicious, dangerous in the quiet way that made older women purse their lips and men lower their eyes. She lived with her grandmother in a small house near the northern edge of the village. Her parents had died when she was very young, of a fever that took too many lives that winter. The villagers said it was a blessing that the grandmother had taken her in. But they also watched Alina closely, not openly but with quiet judgment that clung like smoke. Her grandmother was a healer. She didn't call herself that, but people came anyway, for teas, for salves, for the whispered words she spoke while tying herbs with thread. Alina learned by watching. She asked questions. And sometimes she dreamed things that hadn't happened yet. She didn't tell anyone about the dreams. She didn't tell them about the things she sometimes felt in the woods, like the touch of a memory that didn't belong to her. Or how once she saw two small hollows carved into a tree that seemed to weep when the fog rolled in. The villagers called her strange. Quiet. Too much like her. They didn't say the hollow-eyed woman's name anymore. But they said things like cursed blood, and unnatural sense, and just like the other one. They didn't need to say her name. The fear lived on without it. But Alina didn't fear the past. She wanted to understand it. Even if it meant walking into the mist. Even if it meant hearing the truth that the village had tried to bury under silence, ash, and time. It began on a rainy afternoon, the kind where the fog clung low and the village disappeared in a hush of gray. Alina had been gathering kindling from the back shed when a loose floorboard gave way under her foot. She caught herself before falling, but as she bent to inspect the damage, her fingers brushed against something beneath the broken wood, something wrapped in worn cloth. Her heart quickened as she pulled it out. It was a bundle, carefully wrapped and tied with a thin leather cord. The fabric was soft but faded, smelling faintly of lavender and ash. She glanced toward the cottage as if her grandmother might appear in the doorway and snatch it from her hands. But the house remained still. The only sound was the gentle tapping of rain on the roof. Inside, she unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small wooden box, its surface etched with symbols she didn't recognize. Inside the box were folded scraps of parchment, dried flowers, stones with smooth holes worn through them, a tiny vial of dark liquid, and a carved charm in the shape of an eye. It was like opening a breath from another time. The parchments held writing in a steady, elegant hand, not spells exactly but notes. Observations. Recipes for salves and tinctures. Descriptions of strange dreams. Some of the pages had symbols drawn in the margins. Moons, roots, flames, and eyes. The more she read, the more she realized this was not her grandmother's handwriting. One name appeared again and again, Yold. The name made something stir in Alina's chest. She'd heard it whispered once, maybe twice, in fragments of old stories. Always in warning. Never in truth. She sat beside the fire for hours, reading by the soft light of the flames. The writings painted a very different picture of the woman history had tried to erase. Yold had been a healer. A woman of the forest. People had once come to her not with fear, but with hope, for help with childbirth, for healing herbs, for dreams that wouldn't let them sleep. She had learned from her mother and her mother before her. A long line of women who listened to the land and understood the quiet language of roots and wind and bone. But power, even the gentle kind, draws eyes. And when people see a woman living outside their rules, strong, unwed, wise, they begin to whisper. Whispers grow teeth. The writings didn't tell the whole story of her end, only pieces. Mentions of fear rising in the village, of blame and betrayal. Yold had written of a shadow hanging over the people, not magic but something born of guilt and ignorance. She saw it coming. She knew they would turn on her. Alina read every word with quiet reverence, feeling like a child discovering a piece of herself that had always been missing. Yold wasn't the monster the stories had painted. She was something much more dangerous. She had been free. The charm carved like an eye rested in Alina's palm. It was warm though the room was cold. She held it close to her chest and closed her eyes. She thought of the things her grandmother had taught her without ever saying too much. How to steep herbs for sleep, how to feel a storm in her bones, how to listen to what silence was trying to say. And now she understood why her grandmother had always warned her to be careful. Not of the forest, not of spirits, but of people. Because people feared what they didn't understand. Because once, A woman named Yold had been loved and needed, and then suddenly hated for the same reasons. Because history was not written with truth, but with fear. And the blood that ran through Yold's veins now ran through hers. Alina wasn't afraid of that. She was only afraid of what would happen if no one ever remembered the truth. And something deep inside her, older than her name, older than the village itself, was ready to wake. The fog was thick that morning, curling around the village like a cold breath, hiding the trees in a shifting sea of white. Most people stayed inside when the mist was that heavy. It was an old instinct, learned not taught. Alina, however, stepped into it like someone answering a call. The writing she'd found still pulsed in her thoughts, especially the name, Yold. The words lingered in her chest like heat from a banked fire. For days she couldn't stop thinking about the tree. The one the old stories hinted at, the one said to hold her eyes. No one ever spoke of its exact location, but Alina had always known, somehow. As a child, she'd felt drawn to a clearing just past the second ring of trees, though her grandmother had warned her never to cross the boundary line where the tall stone marker stood, half sunk in moss. That morning she did. The forest swallowed her quickly. The air grew colder. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full. Birds didn't sing. Twigs didn't crack. Even her own breathing felt muffled, like the woods didn't want to be disturbed. Alina pressed on, brushing past wet branches and stepping over roots twisted like sleeping snakes. She moved by memory, by instinct, by something deep and unseen that tugged her forward. Her fingers grazed bark as she passed, grounding herself, whispering small thanks to the trees, an old habit her grandmother had taught her. Then she saw it. The tree rose from the center of a small clearing, black-barked and gnarled, its branches thick like arms reaching out. Mist curled around its base and the air around it felt heavier, older. The tree wasn't just alive. It was watching. Alina approached slowly, breath catching in her throat. Her boots sank slightly into damp soil. As she stepped closer, she saw the carvings. Two perfect hollows stared out from the center of the trunk. Eyes, deep, round, and disturbingly human in size and shape. Sap trickled from the edges, thick and dark, like tears that had been crying for centuries. She reached out, trembling, and touched the edge of one hollow. The moment her fingers met the bark, a sound sliced through the air. Her name. Alina. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. But she felt it, not in her ears but inside her bones. She stumbled back, heart thudding, but didn't run. Her eyes remained fixed on the tree. The fog around her swirled tighter. Then came the visions. Flashes. Blinding and fast. A woman screaming. Her wrists bound. Fire crackling. Hands holding her down. Eyes wide with terror, then darkness. Pain like she had never known shot through her head. She dropped to her knees, clutching her temples, gasping for air. The images came again, layered over the sounds, whispers, prayers, curses. The chanting of frightened people. The sound of salt grinding into wounds. And always the weeping. Not just from Yold, but from the forest itself. Then she saw it, a circle of villagers in the clearing. A younger Yold, proud and unbroken, standing among them with blood running down her face. Her eyes, gone. Still she stood tall. Still she stared. Alina blinked. The vision vanished. The clearing was quiet again. Her hands shook as she stood. The mist was colder now, biting her skin. But she didn't turn away. She looked up at the eyes again, the hollow, carved reminders of what had been taken. "I see you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was speaking to. The woman from the visions? The spirit in the tree? Herself. The forest did not answer, but the air shifted. Just slightly. Something had changed. A feeling pressed against her chest, sorrow deep and wide like the roots beneath her feet. Alina turned to leave, her steps slow. As she walked back through the trees, one thought circled in her mind. She wasn't just seeing the past, was seeing her too. The day the sky turned red began like any other in the village, cold, quiet, and tense. But by mid-afternoon, a strange heat crept in beneath the clouds. The wind smelled of metal. The elders muttered and clutched their prayer beads. Children were rushed indoors. The sun hung low and wrong, casting a strange amber hue across the fields. Alina stood in the doorway of her grandmother's house, watching the sky. Her chest felt tight, like something inside her was winding up, waiting to snap. The forest at the edge of the village swayed without wind. Leaves whispered secrets she couldn't quite hear. Then as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the moon rose, full, swollen, and stained a deep, vivid red. Gasps rose from windows. A few people dropped to their knees. Blood moons were bad omens here. Stories told of madness, of miscarriages, of animals turning violent and wells running dry. But for Alina the red moon meant something else. Her body tensed, then crumpled. She collapsed where she stood, her hands still clinging to the doorway. Her grandmother's voice reached her only faintly, like a memory from underwater. Then there was nothing. Darkness. Then flame. In her dream, she stood in the clearing again, but it wasn't empty this time. A crowd surrounded her. Faces twisted by fear and fury. Their mouths moved in shouts, but she couldn't hear their words. They pointed. Some held torches. Others held stones. And in the center, bound and bleeding, stood Yold. Alina saw her clearly now, tall, proud, dirt-streaked but unbent. Her long dark hair tangled, her hands bound in front of her. A smear of blood ran down her temple, and yet her eyes, oh her eyes, still burned with clarity. With defiance. Then the priest stepped forward. His face was hollow, eyes cold and lips tight with false sorrow. He held a curved blade. Yold didn't beg. She didn't scream. She looked at the villagers, at each face and said nothing. But her gaze pierced them. It stripped away their masks, revealing their fear, their guilt, their lies. And then as the blade came close, Alina saw something impossible. Yold's vision expanded. It stretched beyond the clearing. Beyond the flames. Beyond time. Through her eyes, Alina saw not just the moment of pain to come, but what had been, and what would be. She saw the same people who condemned Yold whispering apologies years later when no one was listening. She saw the children of the accusers growing up to bear the same shame. She saw a girl, Alina herself, standing at the tree touching the eyes, waking something long buried. Yold had known. In her final moments, her sight was stolen, but her seeing had begun. She saw the truth beneath the lies. The fear behind the violence. The sorrow behind the rage. She saw the future and she saw Alina in it, not as a bystander but as a mirror. As the blade came down, Alina wanted to scream. She reached forward, but the dream dissolved into smoke and red sky. The world tilted. She awoke gasping, her face wet with tears. The room was dark, the only light coming from the red moon shining through the window. Her grandmother knelt beside her, eyes wide with worry. But Alina couldn't speak. She was still seeing. The dream hadn't ended. It had opened her eyes. Alina awoke in silence, but it was not the same kind of silence she had always known. It was heavier now, fuller, like the world itself was holding its breath. Her head throbbed with the weight of something new, and her body felt like it had been borrowed by something older while she slept. The memory of Yold's final gaze, so wide and all-seeing, still shimmered behind her eyes. She blinked slowly and sat up. The room looked familiar, her grandmother's old wooden floor, the iron kettle steaming gently in the hearth, the worn chair by the window. But everything shimmered faintly, as if a thin veil of light and shadow had been pulled over the world. Then she saw her grandmother. Not just her but something around her. A soft flicker of color, like the shimmering edge of a flame. It danced around her shoulders, pale gray and blue, laced with threads of sorrow. Alina stared, heart quickening. "Your eyes?" her grandmother whispered, voice trembling. "Child, what's happened to your eyes?" Alina turned toward the cracked mirror by the doorway. In the dim light, her reflection stared back. Her eyes, once a soft hazel, were now lit with a faint glow, silver at the center, as if the moon itself had kissed her pupils. I see things," Alina murmured. "Things that aren't really there. But also, are." Her grandmother made the sign of protection across her chest, but she didn't step back. "You've been marked," she said softly. Just like her. That day Alina stepped outside again. The red moon was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, as though it had left fingerprints on the sky. She walked through the village, her steps cautious, heart pounding, unsure what she was searching for, until the world began revealing itself. A man passed her and she saw it immediately. Around his shoulders curled a thick, inky cloud. It pulsed and twitched, full of guilt. It slithered down his back and whispered in shapes. Alina didn't know what he had done, not yet, but she felt it. The heaviness. The hiding. A group of women whispered near the well. Their laughter was light, but around their mouths flickered sharp points of jealousy and judgment. Alina saw the bitterness curl around their throats like smoke. Even children carried shadows. Small ones, hurts not yet understood, fears picked up from their parents' warnings. The village she had known all her life was no longer a place of smiles and routines. It was layered with secrets. And her new sight peeled those layers back. As the day went on, her senses sharpened. She started noticing patterns. She saw old stains on doorways that had once been marked with blood, cleansing rituals disguised as protection. She saw symbols carved into stones not for safety but to accuse. And she began to understand. Many of the stories told about witches, about curses and illnesses and children falling ill, had been lies. Blame disguised as belief. There were signs of punishment disguised as protection. In the corner of the marketplace she found an old abandoned stall. The shadows clung to it, thick and still. She saw for a flash, a younger woman dragged there, tied and humiliated, a scar left across her cheek. Accused of making a child ill with a look. Alina had no name for her, but the shame still echoed in the air. The village had buried its sins, blaming women like Yol to keep its own secrets safe. Now those secrets had nowhere to hide. By evening, Alina sat alone beneath the great oak near her home, trying to breathe. The weight of what she had seen filled her lungs like fog. She could no longer unsee the truths stitched into every glance, every hushed conversation. Her grandmother approached quietly and sat beside her. "You know now," the old woman said. Alina nodded. "I thought she was a story. A warning." "She was a warning," her grandmother said, her eyes distant. "But not in the way they wanted her to be. She was a warning that truth always finds a way back. No matter how deep they try to bury it." Alina stared at her glowing reflection in the water at their feet. "Why me?" "Because you were never afraid to ask why," her grandmother said. "And now you have the eyes to see the answers." Alina didn't reply. The wind rustled the branches overhead. A quiet shiver passed through the earth. She knew something now. This gift, this curse, wasn't just for looking. It was for revealing. And the village would never be the same again. It began with silence. The council sat in the stone hall at the heart of the village, just as they had for generations. 7 elders, cloaked in tradition, lined the long table, faces carved with age, mouths tight with suspicion. Behind them, the wall bore the same ancient markings, runes and charms supposedly meant to protect the people from dark forces. But now, for the first time in years, someone had come not to ask but to accuse. Alina stood before them, shoulders square, voice steady. Her eyes, silver-flecked, glowing faintly, swept the room. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't begging. She wasn't a frightened girl. Not anymore. "You called her a witch," she said, her voice echoing against the stone. "But it wasn't about magic. It was about power. And fear." The elders shifted in their chairs. Murmurs rose like smoke, uneasy and defensive. "You don't know what you're talking about," barked Elder Male, the oldest and most respected. "Those were different times. Dangerous times." Alina tilted her head. "Were they? Or did you just want to stay in control?" Gasps whispered through the watching villagers at the edges of the room. The council chamber, usually empty during meetings, had drawn a crowd today. Word had spread about Alina's visions, her strange new eyes, the way people couldn't lie in her presence. She stepped forward. "I see your fear, Elder Male. I see the guilt that clings to you like dust on old bones. You were there when the last woman was banished. You said she cursed the well. But it was your nephew who poisoned it, wasn't it? To hide his theft." The elder's face turned pale. More murmurs. She turned to Elder Bryn. "You blamed Yold for your son's fever. Said she cursed him for refusing her. But you forgot, I can see now. I saw your son's bruises. He was ill because you beat the anger into him." Bryn looked away, jaw tight, hands trembling. Every accusation landed like a stone. Not because Alina shouted, but because no one could deny what she revealed. The glowing truth in her eyes cut through the layers of stories, of justifications and fear. "You called them witches," Alina said softly, "because they healed without your approval. Because they spoke when told to stay silent. Because they didn't kneel." The crowd was still now. Watching. Listening. They were not threats. You made them into threats. A woman from the back of the room stepped forward. Mira, a baker's wife. Her voice shook. "My great-aunt disappeared when she was 17. They said she ran off with a traveler. But my grandmother always said they came for her in the night, after she helped a woman give birth." Another voice joined. Then another. Names resurfaced. Stories long whispered in kitchens and behind closed doors now spilled into the open. Faces once forgotten were remembered. The council sat frozen. For the first time in memory they had no words. "You tried to bury the truth," Alina said, her voice gentle now. "But it grew roots. And now it's blooming." One of the youngest elders, a woman named Thera, finally spoke. Her voice cracked. "We thought we were protecting the village," she whispered. "That's what they told us when we were children." Alina nodded. Maybe some believed it. But belief doesn't undo harm. The tension broke. The hall wasn't just a room anymore, it was a wound splitting open. Some elders wept. Others stood and walked out. A few shouted defensively, but the villagers didn't look away this time. They didn't quiet down. The silence of fear had been broken. By the end of the day, the council chamber was no longer sacred. It was stained with truth. And the village, built on control and fear, began to crack. Not completely. Not yet. But something had shifted, finally and forever. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment the sky was gray and heavy, and the next, it split open with wind and fury. Thunder cracked like the earth itself was breaking apart. Rain poured down in sharp sheets, soaking the village in minutes. But no one went inside. Because Alina was already standing in the square. Her long cloak clung to her body, drenched, her silver-glowing eyes shining brighter than the lightning above. Wind tangled her hair around her face, but she didn't flinch. She stood at the center of the old stones, where the village had once gathered to judge and condemn. Now they came to listen. Behind her, the ancient tree swayed like a sentinel. The bark where Yold's eyes had been carved shimmered faintly, as if remembering. Alina raised her hands, palms open. The wind howled louder. A ring of fireflies, out of season, impossibly bright, circled her feet. And then she spoke. But it wasn't her voice. It was deeper. Older. Tired and powerful. You called me witch. You called me cursed. But you never asked why I was not afraid of you. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The elders stumbled back. The villagers fell silent, eyes locked on her glowing form. Alina's arms trembled. She was barely holding on. Something was inside her, Yold's spirit, her memories, her pain. It poured through her, scorching and cold all at once. The storm exploded with another crash of thunder. And then it began. Visions spilled into the air like smoke rising from the earth. They weren't just seen, they were felt. Everyone standing there watched the past come alive. A woman screaming, tied to a post. Children weeping as their mother was dragged away. The council, younger, colder, holding torches and shouting lies. Blood staining the roots of the old tree. Men trembling, not from the woman's power, but from their own cowardice. It was as if the village was being forced to remember not just what it had done, but what it had become. One woman collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "That was my mother," she whispered. "They told me she died in childbirth." A young man gripped his head and screamed. He backed away, staring at the visions like they were claws reaching for him. No, it wasn't real, it wasn't real. A merchant dropped his staff and ran into the woods, muttering prayers. The truth didn't come gently. It tore through the village like the storm, showing what had been hidden, who had betrayed whom, who had stayed silent, who had profited. And through it all, Alina held firm. Yold's spirit pulsed inside her, not with hatred but with grief. Grief so old it had turned to steel. "You feared me," the voice echoed. "But you never feared yourselves." A bolt of lightning struck the tree behind her. The bark split, but instead of fire, light spilled from the crack, white and humming. One of the elders, Thera, dropped to her knees. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know it was like this." But others turned away. Faces twisted, hands over ears trying to shut it out. They didn't want to see. They couldn't bear it. Because once the past becomes truth, it can no longer be blamed on myth. When the last vision faded, Alina fell to her knees, gasping. Rain soaked her through and the glow in her eyes dimmed, but didn't vanish. She looked up at the villagers, the elders, the ones who stayed and the ones who had fled. "Now you know," she said, hoarse and shaking. "Now you all remember." Thunder rolled once more. And in that silence, something ancient lifted. Not forgiven, but released. The storm passed in the night, leaving the village silent beneath a silver sky. Morning broke with a strange stillness, no birdsong, no breeze, only the hush of a place that had finally stopped holding its breath. Alina rose before the sun. Her limbs ached, her head throbbed, but something inside her pulled her forward. She knew where she needed to go. Not because she remembered, but because she felt it. The forest greeted her not with fear, but recognition. The trees parted gently as she walked, mist curling around her ankles. The path led her true, guiding her to the clearing where it all began. Where it all had ended. And where something waited to begin again. The old tree stood tall, its bark still scorched from the lightning strike, but alive. More alive than ever. Light shimmered softly along its trunk, like veins beneath skin. As Alina stepped closer, she felt warmth, not heat but something older. Something sacred. She placed her hand gently against the bark, fingers resting where the carved eyes had once stared blankly into the village's memory. "I brought you back," she whispered. The moment she spoke, light bloomed from beneath her palm. It pulsed once, twice, and then spread like a heartbeat across the bark. The tree responded. From within the wood, two glowing eyes opened, no longer empty carvings but living, radiant orbs. They didn't blink. They didn't threaten. They simply watched. Calm. Still. At peace. Alina felt the essence rise from her chest, not painful, not violent. A soft exhale. Like letting go of a long-held breath. Yold's spirit, once trapped in rage and memory, flowed into the tree like water finding its source. The eyes in the bark glowed brighter and the air shimmered. For a moment, Alina thought she might weep. But the tree wasn't mourning. It was whole. It was home. As the light settled, she stepped back. She blinked and something inside her shifted. Her sight, those strange silver visions, dimmed. The shadows that once clung to people, the glowing truths that danced behind their words, faded from view. The glow in her eyes softened. But the knowing remained. She still remembered every truth she had seen. Every pain, every secret, every name history tried to bury. She couldn't see them anymore, not with her eyes, but they lived in her heart now, like stories etched in stone. Alina smiled, a quiet thing. "You see now," she said to the tree, voice barely louder than the wind. "And so do I." She turned, slowly walking away. The forest didn't feel forbidden anymore. It felt like it had been waiting for someone to come, not to conquer, but to listen. Behind her, the tree stood watchful and radiant. And in the village, though they did not yet know it, something had changed. Justice didn't always arrive with flames or fury. Sometimes, it returned in the form of light. And two eyes, once stolen, now watched over them all. Years passed, but the memory of that storm never faded from the village. They stopped calling her witch out loud, but the word still clung to Alina like mist around her shoulders. Not in hatred, not anymore. But in awe, in caution, in quiet reverence. Some whispered it with fear. Others with hope. She lived on the edge of the forest now, in a small stone house surrounded by herbs, charms, and flowers that bloomed even in the wrong season. No one dared tear them up. No one tried to chase her out. Because the villagers had learned. When their children grew feverish, they came to her door. When crops withered or dreams turned dark, they slipped notes beneath her window or left gifts at her gate, honey, bread, small carved tokens. They rarely knocked, and when they did, they kept their eyes lowered. Not out of shame, but out of something deeper. Something like humility. Alina wore a blindfold now. Soft, silken, always clean. It covered the eyes that once glowed like moonlight and fire, the eyes that had seen too much and held too many truths. But the blindfold didn't hide weakness. It was her choice. Her way of showing that her vision was no longer for show. It wasn't a weapon. It was a knowing that came from within. She never stumbled. She never needed help to find what others tried to hide. Even without sight, she saw more than anyone else ever had. They would come to her doorstep, men with secrets buried deep, women with sorrow tucked behind their smiles, children clutching torn dolls or limp herbs, and she would listen. Sometimes she would speak. Sometimes she would simply place a hand on theirs. She always knew what they needed even if they didn't. And when they left, they always looked back once, as if trying to understand how someone with no eyes could see so clearly. Alina never asked for thanks. She never asked for loyalty. She asked only that they remember. Not just her, but Yold. And all the women who came before. The ones who were silenced, burned, blinded, buried. The ones who had been wise and bold and unwanted. She tended to her garden. She taught the brave ones, mostly girls but a few boys too, how to listen to the earth, how to feel stories in the wind, how to read the truth in their own hearts. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Because everyone knew, this was no longer the village it once was. And Alina was no longer just a girl. She had become something new. A healer. A keeper of memory. A new kind of witch. Even years later, the village never truly forgot. Children, as children do, turned truth into stories. They whispered them during games, passed them around like secrets. In the soft hush of twilight, they dare each other to sneak close to the edge of the forest, where the herbs grew too wild, and the air carried a scent no one could name. "She sees without eyes," they would say, crouched in the grass, giggling behind their hands. "She knows if you lie. She can hear your heart beating." Some swore they saw her, Alina, the woman in the blindfold, gliding through the woods barefoot, her long cloak trailing behind her like smoke. They'd claim her footsteps made no sound, that the animals never ran from her and sometimes followed her. The forest had changed too. It was no longer a place of fear, no longer a boundary between safety and shadow. It had become something else. Not tame. Never tame. But aware. Listening. Birdsong filled the trees in spring. The wind curled gently through the branches, whispering not warnings but welcomes. Some children even wandered beneath the trees, leaving ribbons or little trinkets near the old tree with the hollow eyes. They didn't know why, it just felt right. And that tree? It still stood, tall and ancient and glowing faintly under moonlight. The crack in its bark had healed, but not completely. It remained, a silver line, like a scar that chose not to fade. And on certain nights, when the sky was especially clear and the wind especially still, two faint lights could be seen within it. Not empty. Not angry. Just watching. With wisdom. With patience. With the kind of knowing that time alone cannot give. Some said it was the spirit of Yold, keeping watch over the village that once betrayed her. Others believed it was something older, something that had finally been heard and answered. But Alina knew the truth. She had passed the stories down, not to warn but to remind. And when she stood beneath the tree alone, she didn't whisper. She simply nodded. Because the past had found peace. And the forest was no longer silent. It whispered too.